Today we have our third day of Weber. We will be discussing The Politics as a Vocation, a very interesting essay, which was originally a lecture, which he gave 1 year before he died. There are what is known as the vocation essays with Max Weber. We have the science as a vocation and politics as a vocation. Science as a vocation I offered as a optional reading. However, it's a bit more technical than politics as a vocation. I do recommend, if you find the time and you are interested in reading Science as a Vocation on your own time, please do so. It is well worth the read. You could read it in maybe 45 minutes or so. Today, however, we will be discussing Politics as a Vocation, which is a very easy essay to understand, at least in comparison to Weber's other writings. It was originally a speech delivered at the University of Munich in 1919, where Weber was teaching at the time, just 1 year before he died. Weber begins the essay by describing how the state has a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, i.e. violence. By saying that they have a monopoly on the legitimacy of force, he is saying that other people, private individuals, cannot use violent means in a legitimate way. Sure, people are violent, but they are not perceived as being justified in doing so. The state has a monopoly. It is the only entity in society that is legitimate and seen as justified for using violent force in the world. The state, Weber says, is a relation of human beings, and this relationship is one of domination, where some human beings dominate other human beings, and this domination is considered to be legitimate when it is done in the hands of the state, as opposed to a private individual dominating another private individual would not be perceived as legitimate or justified. There are three forms of justification for this domination that Weber would like to go over in the beginning of this essay. The first is traditional domination, or as he says, the authority of the eternal yesterday, meaning traditionalist values, the more sanctified through the unimaginably ancient recognition and habitual orientation to conform. These traditions sort of invoke a habit of conforming to these norms that we have established in this traditional form of domination. There is then the charismatic domination, which I will read here, is the authority of the extraordinary and personal gift of grace, charisma, the absolutely personal devotion and personal confidence in revelation, heroism, or other qualities of individual leadership. This is a charismatic domination, as exercised by the prophet, or in the field of politics, by the elected warlord, the plebiscitarian ruler, the great demagogue, or the political party leader. And then finally, he talks about the domination by legality, saying that this virtue of legality is a belief in the validity of the legal statute and the competence of creating rational rules in society. Most of you have probably heard of the term charisma. Max Weber is the reason that we really have the word charisma. That's not to say that he coined it or invented it. The term was invented in the 1st century by St. Paul. It was a very esoteric, very obscure theological term for hundreds and hundreds of years, all the way into the mid-19th century, when a Lutheran jurist named Rudolf Sohm used the term in some of his writings. Max Weber saw Sohm's writings and sort of made the term charisma more recognizable, especially considering the fact that Weber became huge onto the academic scene later on, whereas Sohm has not remained within the collective consciousness of sociology. I couldn't help myself but to include the fact that I understand charisma has been shortened down to Riz, as the kids say. I am told that those on the internet of a particular age are familiar with Riz, short for charisma. And it's interesting to see how far we have progressed from from uh, St. Paul, Max Weber, and now the TikTok. So a little interesting progression. Charisma is acquired by the person who has answered a sort of calling, what Weber calls a calling. It is a fulfilling of a devotion, a fulfilling of their true mission. Charisma, Weber says, has emerged in all places and all time. The leader who is charismatic is perceived as being extraordinary, very different from everybody else. He or she has these sort of invincible capacities that ordinary people do not have. And he or she is also has very sincere intentions of protecting their following community. It is important to note that charisma is not just a trait that the leader has, it's not just a quality of a leader. Charisma is a trait that is the product of an interaction between follower and leader. Weber makes it very clear that what is most important is that the follower recognizes the leader having this trait. If the leader is not recognized by followers as having this trait, then they are not charismatic. A person cannot be charismatic without a following. The following needs to acknowledge that they have these abilities. The followers need to believe that the leader is invincible and incapable of failure. That is not to say that the leader actually needs to be invincible. In fact, they are not. They just need to convince followers that they are in order to develop charisma. The leader must be seen as sincere in his or her motivations. The leaders can trick followers, can persuade them into believing that's true even when they have different intentions. And they need to be able to persuade followers that they are invincible and will use their invincible capabilities to take down everybody who is against their followers, against the community. The charismatic leader is often seen as a sort of outsider who will take down the establishment. They have the ability to invoke a great deal of excitement. Charismatic leaders have a sort of magnetic allure, a magnetic personality that really excites crowds and leads to a great deal of emotionality in many different contexts, whether in political contexts, religious contexts, or even in the context of sports and celebrity. If the charismatic leader fails in an important endeavor, if he or she fails to protect the followers and keep their well-being, then he or she will lose his charisma. They will not any longer be seen as being invincible, because an invincible person would never fail. So, if in cases when the person does fail, the followers then no longer believe in the invincibility, and thus the charisma disappears. Again, it is the followers' recognition of the quality, not the objective quality itself, with which Weber is concerned when he discusses charismatic authority. Charisma is used for is attached to a wide range of characters. I'm going to start with politics since that's the subject of this essay, though it's worth noting that charisma extends to other domains outside of politics. Charisma can be found on both the left and the right. Charisma is not necessarily a good or a bad thing. It can be a good thing and it can be a very bad thing. Like Weber says, we have seen charisma in all history and throughout, not only throughout time, but in all places. Charisma has been found within good leaders and within evil leaders as well. Populace, meaning those who have a sort of anti-elite stance. Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders are very different, but they share a commonality in that they are both populists. Donald Trump is, of course, a conservative populist, whereas Bernie Sanders is a left-wing populist. The thing that they have in common is that they both rail against the establishment. They both are very anti-elite. Populism, this anti-elite style, is conducive to charisma because they are seen as being sincere. They're seen as being outsiders, not colluding with establishment actors who are said to be elitist in their intentions. So they convince their followers, and whether or not you believe they're being sincere, totally up to you as the followers. They convince their followers that they are outsiders who are only doing what they're doing to protect the community. It is worth noting that charisma is helped when there are these sort of anti-charismatic figures who are opponents of the charismatic leader. So people, very familiar faces like Hillary Clinton in the Democratic Party or Jeb Bush in the Republican Party, are seen as sort of anti-charismatic because they have been within the establishment for so long. They are sort of more of tradition, more of establishment, more of engaging in things as they are, the status quo, rather than offering a sort of a new message that is more exciting. It is for this reason that these sort of figures like Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush are sort of seen as unexciting political personalities. As I say, charisma can be found in a wide range of people, people we typically would not really associate with one another or say their names in the same breath. Again, Weber says we find charisma in so many different times and contexts. Charisma can be used by evil people such as Adolf Hitler, or good people such as Martin Luther King. Scholars have used the word charisma to describe both of these leaders. When there is just an unconditional devotion from followers and a sort of excitement and allure among your following that you have, as Hitler had in Germany and as Martin Luther King had in mid-20th century America, one has charisma, whether one is moral or evil. There is also this sort of paradox of charisma, because although the charismatic leader needs to convey that they are extraordinary, that they are different from the ordinary person in their capabilities, they also try to develop a sort of relatable character so that people think that they have their interests at heart, so that people think that they are sincere, that they are like them, that they have the same goals just like the followers have. So there's a sort of paradox of trying to be ordinary and extraordinary. Extraordinary with the intentions of fulfilling the ordinary intention. Jair Bolsonaro, pictured on the right here, for example, is a populist leader in Brazil, who is said to be who is said to be charismatic because people believed that he was acting in politics with a strong connection to God, with some people so mesmerized by Bolsonaro that they even said that he is God. It's worth noting that charisma can, though does not necessarily, arise when followers believe that the leader has a close connection to God and that God is using the leader to fulfill God's will. On the pictured here on the left is former member of Parliament Nigel Farage, who is sort of, does something that a lot of populist politicians do by trying to seem relatable with a pint of beer and whatnot, and being boisterous and sort of bad-mannered and seemingly lowbrow, despite, of course, being a lot of elite politicians do this to not come off as too much of distant elitists. And as I say, it's not only politics that charisma can be found in. This is a picture of a megachurch where certain televangelists really, rock the crowd, so to speak. Really develop a euphoric atmosphere through people's devotion to the words that they have to say. So it's not just in politics that charisma exists. It's also often connected to religious contexts, and it extends beyond that too. I would say celebrity context is probably a small yet maybe growing literature. So Weber says that there are two ways of making politics one vocation. Either one lives for politics or one lives off politics. He who lives for politics makes politics his life in an internal sense. Either he enjoys the naked possession of the power he exerts, or he nourishes his inner balance and self-feeling by the consciousness that his life has meaning in the service of a cause. He who strives to make politics a permanent source of income lives off politics as a vocation, whereas he who does not do this lives for politics. Under normal conditions, the politician must be economically independent of the income politics can bring him. This means quite simply that the politician must be wealthy or must have a personal position in life which yields a sufficient income. The professional politician must also be economically dispensable, that is, his income must not depend upon the fact that he constantly and personally places his ability in thinking entirely, or at least by far predominantly, in the service of economic acquisition. All right, so this sort of independent wealthiness that leads toward a sense of sincerity and charisma is often captured. A notable example that I provide only because you all might be familiar with it would be this quote here from Donald Trump, who says, "I don't need anybody's money. It's nice. I don't need anybody's money. I'm using my own money. I'm not using the lobbyists. I'm not using donors. I don't care. I'm really rich. I'll show you that in a second. And by the way, I'm not even saying that in a braggadocious. That's the kind of thinking you need for this country." So he's essentially saying that he doesn't have a motive for personal gain, a motive for economic gain in the way that maybe other establishment politicians do, because he's independently wealthy. He doesn't live off of politics. Living off of politics would mean that you are engaged in politics for an income. Living for politics usually comes along with being independently wealthy and thus being able to have sort of sincere intentions in the way Donald Trump claims to have. Again, of course, it's worth noting that it's all about whether or not one convinces followers that you are sincere in your intentions, not whether or not you actually are sincere in your intentions. Charismatic domination gives followers a sense of that there's a person there. Rather than getting attached or excited by mere party platforms, charismatic allure gives a sort of personable element to political attraction. Parties, Weber says, are merely job hunters, they're vote grabbers, they'll do anything and they don't really care about principles often. They will do whatever it takes to grab votes and they will change their principles willy-nilly. It doesn't really matter. Their main intention is to gain more votes, not to have a consistent and moral set of principles. To rule without a calling is to show a lack of charisma, and as a sort of outsider insurgent would say, the rule of the clique, the rule of the establishment, the elite who control everything and don't really have principles but only want to maintain their power and maintain the status quo. Being a politician allows the person who becomes a politician to have power over others, which allows them to rise above their sense of routine and sort of transcend routine in the way that we talked about in the last lecture on Weber. Weber then asks us, what kind of man must one be to put his hand on the wheel of history? It is from this question we move forward with until the end of the lecture. The three fundamental qualities that this man must be, according to Weber, are passion, responsibility, and proportion. Passion involves a devotion to the cause. However, mere devotion, mere passion alone is not enough, is not sufficient for a strong politician. It is not just a devotion to a cause, but rather a sense of responsibility to that cause. Responsibility to that cause and passion are tempered through what he calls proportion. It's able to maintain a distance from these matters. Political matters are very serious, sometimes very tragic matters, and one cannot become overly emotional or overly excited by only expressing passion alone, but rather passion through a motivation of responsibility that is tempered by proportion. It is this three-quality relation and harmony that creates a sort of charismatic personality in the political sphere. There's this very human impulse to become emotional and distressed by these matters because, as I say, such political topics can be incredibly emotionally investing and exhausting, tragic. Politics has a very dark side. And so when dealing with these serious matters, the person with a strong political personality must demonstrate this harmonious balance between passion, responsibility, and proportion. Weber, within this discussion, refers to the quote-unquote sin, as he puts it, of seeking objectives in politics, making the objective just acquiring power for power's sake, just to get power because one can, just to have that lust for domination for the sake of it, and engage in a sort of self-indulgent self-intoxication, as he puts it. If there is no substantive purpose attached to the follower's well-being, then the leader is not actually acting out of passion or responsibility. When this form of insincerity, if the person seems as if they're only trying to get into politics in order to become more powerful or for their own personal gain, they will not be seen as charismatic by followers. Insincerity and fakeness lead to the evaporation of charisma. In further managing this emotion of passion, Weber talks about how politics is really tricky terrain, and only a utopian would believe that only good can come from good and that only evil can come from evil. Sometimes Weber is insinuating there are necessary evils or a greater good could come out of an evil. Those who fail to recognize the fact that it is not only good that comes from good, and it's not only evil that comes from evil. Weber refers to people who do not recognize this fact of politics as quote-unquote political infants. The politician, Weber says, must understand that he or she must do what must be done, using the example of war, for example. There's a sort of depersonalization that occurs then with the politician who needs to maintain a type of distance. This is how devotion and passion are tempered by proportion, by creating distance, by depersonalizing political matters. He goes on to say that one who seeks salvation should not go along the route of politics. Again, we went over these tensions between the political sphere and religion in the previous lecture. The genius or demon of politics, as he puts it, is placed in tension with the God of love, the universalist salvation religions that demand the ethic of brotherliness are in tension with the types of actions that politicians need to make. On this point in the complexity of morality in politics, Weber invokes the quote, "The devil is old, grow old to understand him." The politician essentially needs to face these harsh aspects of the political sphere rather than descend into a sort of infantile utopianism. The politician must stand up to this and say things such as, Weber says, "The world is stupid and base, not I." The politician must stand in spite of the stupidity and vile nature of politics and try to eradicate said stupidity and evil. there's a sort of responsibility where he says, "Here I stand, I could do no other." There's a meaning that this is the action that I must do. It's not something that you want to do out of personal intoxication, self-indulgence, or giving yourself a pat on the back, but this is the type of behavior that you have been, quote-unquote, called to do. Political decisions, he says, are made with the head. One needs to understand the harsh realities of political decision-making, but not the head alone. Those who are not spiritually dead, he says, will come to this line saying, "Here I stand, I could do no other." So, head alone does not do it. Heart alone does not do it. Passion and responsibility are not contrasts, but supplements. Finding the way that these two things can supplement one another comes together to materialize into what we know as having the calling for politics. Returning to this tension between the political sphere and religion, he claims that those who wish to have a sort of plain, typical, ordinary ethic of brotherliness that religion demands should never have gotten into politics in the first place. Politics demands a sort of lifestyle that is so in contrast and so incompatible with the type of ethics that religion demands, that salvation of religion demands. He discusses how human beings could only prove what is possible by at least attempting to reach out for what is impossible, and those who reach out for what is impossible are not those typical folks who adhere to a standard ethic of brotherliness, but rather heroic leaders who exist outside of the confines of daily routine. I will read the final quote of this essay here, which sums up many of the themes we discussed today. Only he has the calling for politics who is sure that he will not crumble when the world, from his point of view, is too stupid or base for what he wants to offer. Only he who in the face of all this can say, in spite of all, has the calling for politics.